The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze over the suburban streets, the kind that made even the most mundane neighborhood seem timeless. As the streetlights flickered to life, the rhythmic hum of the distant freeway was drowned out by the chorus of crickets, a backdrop to a silence too thick with tension to be entirely peaceful. John Davis sat in his kitchen, staring at the untouched pile of paperwork on the table in front of him. His fingers absently traced the edge of an old coffee mug, the ceramic worn from years of use. He had been a single parent for nearly 3 years now, the early days of grief long since faded into the dull ache of routine. There was nothing particularly exciting about his life anymore, just the constant struggle to keep everything in balance. Emily, his 6-year-old daughter, had become his world, his purpose. Every decision he made revolved around her. And yet, even that felt like a weight sometimes. "Hey, Dad, when's my sitter getting here?" Emily's voice echoed from the hallway, breaking his thoughts. John sighed. He had nearly forgotten that he had called a babysitter for the evening. It had been a rare decision, a fleeting hope to steal a few hours for himself, to reconnect with something that wasn't just parenting. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair and stood, moving to the door. "Any minute now," he muttered, trying to summon the energy to play the part of a responsible, adult man, something he was still struggling to come to terms with. But no matter how much he pretended everything was okay, the cracks were visible to anyone who cared enough to look. And Emily, his brilliant, inquisitive daughter, cared too much, asking too many questions. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. John froze. It was a small, but unmistakable jolt to his system. He hadn't expected the sitter to be here so soon. But then again, he hadn't expected anything in the past few years to go as planned. He took a deep breath, fighting the rising tide of anxiety, and opened the door. And there she stood. At first glance, the woman who greeted him seemed ordinary enough. She had long brown hair, the kind that shimmered like silk, and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling brilliance, almost too bright, too vivid. Her features were sharp, but not in a harsh way. She had a quiet strength about her, something that felt like it had weathered more than just time. "I'm Lyra," she said, her voice smooth like velvet, carrying a subtle accent that John couldn't quite place. "I'm here for Emily." John nodded, but the words stuck in his throat. There was something strange about her, something otherworldly that clung to her like a second skin. He couldn't put his finger on it. She was just different. It wasn't in her appearance exactly. She was striking, yes, but it was something in the way she held herself, the way her gaze never wavered from his, as if she could see right through him. "Right, of course." John stepped aside, his heart beating a little too fast for comfort. "She's just in the living room." As Lyra entered, John couldn't help but notice how silently she moved. There was no sound of footsteps, nothing to suggest she was walking. It was like she floated into the room. Emily, for her part, was already bouncing in place, her excited energy contagious. "Hi!" Emily exclaimed, running up to Lyra, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you going to take me to the park?" Lyra smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made John uneasy for reasons he couldn't explain. "That's right, Emily. Would you like that?" Emily nodded eagerly, and John found himself blinking away a strange feeling. It was as if Lyra had already won his daughter's trust without trying. He watched them for a moment, feeling a vague discomfort stir in his chest. The woman's presence was unnerving, but his exhaustion won out. After a moment, he nodded. "I'll be back in a couple of hours," he said, the words automatic. "There's pizza in the fridge if you get hungry." "Thanks, Mr. Davis," Lyra replied, her voice smooth as always. "I'll make sure she's safe." John hesitated before stepping back toward the door, casting a final, uncertain glance at the pair. Emily was already chatting away to Lyra about her day, her voice light and animated. The interaction felt off. It was as though Lyra understood things about his daughter that John hadn't shared with her. The unsettling feeling deepened in his gut, but he shoved it aside. As the door clicked shut behind him, John's mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. What was it about Lyra? There was something not quite right about her, something that lingered in the air even after she'd entered the house. And why had he agreed to let her watch Emily? John ran a hand through his hair, pacing in the dim hallway. He had known better than to trust strangers, especially ones who showed up so suddenly. But he needed a break. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a moment to himself, the last time he had done something just for him. He glanced toward the kitchen, but instead of seeking solace in his solitude, his eyes fell on his daughter's half-finished homework. The guilt gnawed at him. Emily needed him, and in his desperation, he had found it easier to rely on a stranger than to face the things he was too afraid to confront. A soft chime broke through his thoughts, the unmistakable sound of his phone buzzing. He pulled it out, expecting a reminder for work, but the message on the screen froze him in place. Emergency alert, unidentified craft detected near Earth's atmosphere. John stared at the message, confusion and unease pulling at his chest. But before he could process it, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo of Lyra. The caption read, "Watch her closely. She is not what she seems." John's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photo. The image was blurry, but unmistakable. It was her, standing at the window of his house, staring out into the night with a gaze that was colder than ice. His heart slammed against his ribs. Something was terribly wrong. The shadows of evening stretched long across the quiet streets, and John stood frozen in his living room, the phone's harsh light cutting through the dim glow of the setting sun. The photograph still lingered on the screen, each pixel a reminder of how little he truly understood about the woman in his house. Watch her closely. She is not what she seems. The words repeated in his mind like a drumbeat, echoing louder with every passing second. He couldn't make sense of it. The sudden tension in his chest told him that something had shifted, something more than just the unnerving presence of a stranger in his home. His pulse quickened as he glanced towards the window. There, in the growing dusk, he could see the faintest silhouette through the curtains, a figure standing perfectly still. Lyra. He wanted to go to her, to demand answers, but something in his gut told him that wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't fix whatever had just broken in his world. And yet, he had no choice. Emily was upstairs, and Lyra. Lyra was responsible for her safety. Or so he thought. Without a word, John threw on his jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. His breath came out in small puffs, a fog of uncertainty hanging in the space between him and the truth. He walked cautiously, his feet light against the concrete as if trying not to disturb the stillness of the night. When he reached the front door, it stood ajar, slightly wider than before. His heart skipped a beat. Inside, everything was quiet. Lyra had been sitting at the dining table earlier, talking to Emily with a calmness that unsettled John. It was as if she had known Emily her whole life, as if she had been placed in his home with an unnerving precision. But now, silence reigned, thick and oppressive, hanging heavy in the air. "Emily?" John called, his voice a low murmur. A soft giggle drifted from the living room. His heart clenched. He followed the sound, finding the two of them, Lyra and Emily, sitting side by side, with Emily holding Lyra's hand, eyes wide and curious. The sight was innocent enough, but the way they were staring at each other made John's blood run cold. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to mask the panic in his voice. Lyra turned to him with a smile that almost seemed too knowing, like she could see the depths of his soul. "She's a curious one," Lyra said softly, her voice smooth as silk. "She asked me about the stars." Emily, who had been unusually quiet, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "She told me there's a whole universe out there, Daddy. And that we're just one little speck. Isn't that cool?" John's stomach twisted. He forced a smile, trying to keep his composure. "I'm glad you're having fun, sweetie, but it's getting late. Time for bed." Lyra didn't let go of Emily's hand. The grip was subtle, but the way it lingered, just a little too long, sent a jolt of unease through John. There was a calmness about Lyra, a stillness that felt unnatural. Something inside him snapped. "Lyra," he said, his voice sharp, commanding. She didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unblinking, even as Emily shuffled awkwardly beside her, unsure of the sudden shift in energy. "Yes, John," she responded, her voice soft yet filled with an unspoken weight. John hesitated for a moment. He wanted to ask her everything, about the photo, about who she really was, about what she wanted. But instead, something more pressing came to his lips. "Who sent you here?" Lyra's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled again, that same gentle, cryptic smile. "I told you, I'm just here for Emily. I'm just here to keep her safe." "Safe from what?" John pressed, his fists clenching at his sides. The silence that followed was thick with something unsaid, something dangerous. John's eyes never left her face, studying every subtle shift in her expression, trying to find some crack in the armor she had built around herself. But there was none. Finally, Lyra leaned back slightly, letting go of Emily's hand. "It's not your concern," she said. "But there are things you don't understand. Things you can't." Her gaze flicked toward the window, as if she could see beyond it, to a place where John's questions didn't matter. Sometimes, the things we don't understand are the things we need most. John felt his breath catch in his throat. The room felt colder now, more distant, as though the walls were closing in. Emily, sensing the shift, stood up from the couch and walked over to John, wrapping her small arms around his leg. "Daddy, I don't want to go to bed." "I like Lyra," she said quietly, her voice soft, trusting. John looked down at his daughter. The sight of her, so innocent, so unaware, struck him with a wave of guilt. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe. But how could he protect her from something like this? How could he protect her from a woman who seemed to know more about the universe than any human should? "Emily, honey, go upstairs and get ready for bed," he said, his voice unsteady but firm. Emily's lip quivered, but she nodded obediently. She glanced at Lyra one more time before heading upstairs, her footsteps light against the hardwood floor. John waited until he heard the faint sound of Emily's bedroom door close before turning back to Lyra. His eyes were narrow now, sharp with suspicion. "What are you really here for?" For a long moment, Lyra didn't speak. Instead, she simply watched him, her gaze steady and unyielding. Her silence was almost deafening. Then, finally, she exhaled a slow breath and spoke, her voice a whisper that seemed to vibrate the very air between them. "You wouldn't understand," she said, and there was a finality in her tone that made his blood run cold. "But you will. In time." John stepped forward, his chest tight with unease. "No, you're wrong. I'll understand now, or I'll make you leave." Lyra's eyes darkened for a brief moment. But then the tension seemed to evaporate, as if it had never existed. She smiled again, but this time, there was something colder behind it, a flicker of something darker. "Maybe you will," she murmured. "Or maybe you won't." The air shifted, crackling with unspoken truths, as John stood facing the woman who had somehow made her way into his home, and into his life, without ever truly explaining why. John had never been a man who believed in mysteries. Life was simple, you worked hard, you protected what mattered, and you kept your head down when things got rough. But standing there in the dim light of his hallway, his mind reeling with uncertainty, he realized he was no longer certain about the rules. The door to Emily's room was slightly ajar, and the faint hum of her nightlight glowed from within. He had told her to go to bed, but his heart was not settled. Lyra's cryptic words lingered in the air like smoke, "You'll understand in time. Or maybe you won't." What could that possibly mean? Who was this woman, really? Why was she here? John leaned against the doorframe, his eyes tracing the darkened hallway as if the shadows themselves might offer some clue. He had questions, too many questions, and not enough answers. His instinct was to call the authorities, to demand answers. But somehow, deep down, he knew that no one else would understand. Not the way he did. Not the way Emily would. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a moment, he hesitated. But when he saw the name on the screen, Catherine, he didn't think twice. He answered before the second ring. "John, where are you?" Catherine's voice, calm and composed, broke through the fog in his mind. "We need to talk. It's about Emily." John's pulse quickened. "I'm home." "What do you mean, it's about Emily? What's going on?" I can't explain it over the phone," Catherine said, her voice lowering, as if afraid someone might overhear. Just get her out of the house. Don't ask questions. Just do it." John's throat tightened. Catherine was Emily's aunt, his late wife's sister, and though they hadn't always agreed, he knew she cared deeply about their daughter. "What the hell is going on, Catherine? What do you know about Lyra?" There was a long pause. Too long. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice now trembling with urgency. "Lyra isn't who she says she is, John. I didn't want to tell you, but you need to hear this now. She's not just a babysitter. She's here for something else." John's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "You don't have much time," Catherine continued. "Get Emily out of there, now. Get her as far away as you can." John's thoughts raced. He wanted to argue, to demand more information, but Catherine's next words cut him off. "Trust me. Please." With the phone still pressed to his ear, John moved swiftly toward Emily's room. His hand was shaking as he reached for the doorknob. Inside, Emily lay on her bed, curled up with a stuffed animal in her arms, her breathing slow and steady. Lyra was nowhere to be seen. But the unsettling silence was worse than any noise. He stepped into the room, his gaze flicking toward the empty corner where Lyra had been sitting just moments ago. No sign of her. But the air felt charged, as though something had shifted in the room, leaving behind an unspoken weight. John knelt beside Emily's bed, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake. His heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't let his daughter stay here, not with Lyra in the house, not after what Catherine had just said. He had to get her out. With one last glance at the stillness of the room, he picked Emily up in his arms, careful not to disturb her too much. She was light, fragile in his grasp, like a piece of glass. As he turned to leave, his foot brushed against something small and metallic on the floor, a silver pendant. John stooped to pick it up, his fingers brushing over the cool surface. It was an intricate design, like a spiral within a spiral, but the details were too finely crafted to be of any earthly origin. The pendant hummed with a strange energy, vibrating gently in his hand as though it were alive. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Before he could examine it further, the floorboards creaked behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Lyra stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You should have let her sleep," Lyra said, her voice low, almost hypnotic. "She needs rest." John's protective instincts flared. He stepped forward, holding Emily tighter. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. Lyra didn't flinch. "Nothing," she replied, her tone so calm it was maddening. "She's fine. But you're making a mistake." John's grip tightened around the pendant. It was like an anchor, grounding him amidst the growing storm in his mind. "What do you want from me, Lyra? What do you want from my daughter?" Lyra's gaze flickered to the pendant in his hand, and for a moment, John thought he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of something ancient, something far beyond human comprehension. "It's not about what I want," she said, her voice suddenly soft, almost compassionate. "It's about what she needs." "Stop," John said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lyra stepped forward, her presence filling the room, too powerful to ignore. "She is part of something greater than you can understand. And so are you." John's head spun. "I don't care about your games, Lyra. I'm getting Emily out of here." Lyra's lips curved into a knowing smile. "You can't run from this, John. It's already too late." In the instant it took him to react, everything changed. The air in the room seemed to shimmer, and the walls around him seemed to bend, as though the very fabric of reality was warping. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. He staggered back, his heart racing, as a sudden pressure built in the room. Emily stirred in his arms, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Lyra's smile widened, a touch of sadness in her expression. "You're about to find out, little one." John's mind raced as the room seemed to tilt, the world around him unraveling in ways he couldn't comprehend. The pendant pulsed in his hand, its energy resonating with the hum in the air. The truth was dawning on him, slowly but surely. Whatever Lyra was, whatever she had been sent here for, it was far beyond anything he had prepared for. And it was coming for them. The air in the room grew thicker, as if a storm were about to break. John's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of Lyra's words pressing on him like a vice. It's already too late. He hadn't understood what she meant when she said it, but now, as the walls of his home seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar energy, he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of her statement. Emily clung to him, her small body trembling in his arms, her wide eyes searching his face for reassurance. The calm, comforting presence that she had always known from her father, the protector, the constant, was slipping away, unraveling under the weight of something John could no longer control. "Dad, what's happening?" Her voice was quiet, vulnerable. She had always been the brave one between them, but in that moment, John could feel the trembling uncertainty in her. This wasn't something they could face together. Not like this. "I don't know," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The pendant in his hand thrummed with unnatural energy, a low vibration that reverberated through his entire being. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. The hum of it filled the room, a strange, steady pulse that seemed to sync with the beating of his heart. And then, like a switch had been flipped, the room shifted. The walls around him warped, bending like light refracting through water. It was dizzying, disorienting. The house felt alive. He had no idea how or why, but he was certain that this wasn't a trick of the mind. There was power here, something ancient, something beyond earthly understanding. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes dark, her expression unreadable. "You're afraid," she said softly. Her voice had changed, deeper, almost hypnotic. "It's not weakness, John. It's natural. This is bigger than you, bigger than anything you've ever known." John tightened his grip on Emily, but his mind was a storm of questions. What was she? What had she meant by "it's already too late"? "You need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know who you are, but you can't take her." Lyra tilted her head slightly, regarding him with an unsettling calm. "I'm not here to take her, John. I'm here to guide her." She stepped closer, the glow in her eyes intensifying. "And you? You're in this too. You can't turn back." "Guide her where?" John's voice grew harsh, raw with panic. "She's my daughter. You don't get to do this. Whatever you're planning, no." Lyra reached out, her fingers brushing the pendant in John's hand. A spark of energy shot through him at her touch, sharp and electrifying. For a brief moment, he saw her, really saw her, in a way he couldn't explain. Her human form flickered, her face a shifting mass of light and shadow, like the image of a reflection broken by rippling water. There was something not quite human about her, something far older. "I'm not your enemy," Lyra said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "But you're in the way of what's coming. You and Emily. I tried to warn you, John. This is bigger than both of you, and you won't be able to stop it. You'll only hurt each other." He felt a surge of emotion, a wave of love for Emily, a need to protect her, to keep her safe at all costs. But Lyra's words hung in the air like a weight he couldn't shake off. "This is bigger than both of you." John's chest tightened. He had always been her protector, the one who kept the world at bay. But this was no ordinary threat. This wasn't a man he could face down with brute force or logic. He was up against something that defied explanation. He could feel it, that otherness in the air. The rules of his reality were no longer valid. "What do you want from me?" John demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "What's so damn important about Emily?" Lyra's gaze softened for a moment, like a flicker of something human passed through her. "It's not just about her. It's about what she is. What she will become." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "And about what you are, John." The room seemed to close in around them. John's mind spun, his pulse quickening. "What am I?" he asked, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that nearly stopped his heart. "You don't remember. But you will." John shook his head. "No. I don't understand any of this. Why? Why now? Why her?" "Because she is the key." Lyra's words were spoken with such weight, such certainty, that John felt as though they were branded into his soul. "And you? You are the one who can help her unlock it." John's thoughts raced. He had no idea what Lyra was talking about. But he knew one thing for certain: he would do anything to protect Emily. Anything. Suddenly, the room around them seemed to pulse more violently. The walls vibrated, the hum deepening into a roar. It was as though the very foundation of the house was being shaken apart. A strange light began to flood the room, bright, blinding. John shielded his eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The house settled back into its eerie silence. John lowered his hand, blinking against the sudden change. When he opened his eyes, the world around him seemed to be different. The air was thicker, charged with the same strange energy that had flooded the room moments before. Lyra stood before him, unchanged, her expression unreadable. But something in the air had shifted. It was as though they were no longer in the same world. "What did you do?" John whispered. Lyra's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "I didn't do anything. I only opened your eyes." John looked down at Emily, her wide eyes staring up at him, and in that moment, he realized something chilling: she wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was something else. Something far greater. "I don't understand," John murmured, his voice thick with disbelief. Lyra placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch cool, almost soothing. "You will, John. Soon enough, you will. You'll see the truth of what she is. Of what you are." John's world had fractured. There were no more clear answers, only questions that stretched infinitely before him. But one thing was certain now: his life, his daughter's life, would never be the same. As the truth began to settle in, the one thing John could no longer ignore was the stark reality: they had already crossed a line they couldn't uncross. And the world he thought he knew was slipping through his fingers.